that felt good. Don't worry, Claire. Your knight in shining armor is here.
There is perhaps no game in the entire Resident Evil canon that is as divisive as Code Veronica. It was the first game in the series not to take place in the Midwestern suburban town of Raccoon City. It was the first game not to be released on the Sony PlayStation. And perhaps most importantly, it was the first game in the franchise not to have a number attached to it. After the massive financial success of Resident Evils 1 and 2 in the late 90s, an uncertainty resonated that created multiple paths forward for the series. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis released on the aging PlayStation hardware in 1999, and Code Veronica was being developed for the hot new Sega Dreamcast, initially touted as the true sequel to Resident Evil 2, the most acclaimed game of the original trilogy. Nemesis, despite its uncertain state as a numbered sequel in the franchise, got the remake treatment in 2020, a year after Resident Evil 2 did, to huge acclaim. But then Capcom skipped Code Veronica, going right to the safest option, remaking 2005's Resident Evil 4, by most accounts the most popular game in Resident Evil history. Code Veronica didn't sell well, despite getting a re-release for the PlayStation 2 a year after the ill-fated launch on Sega's final console. But the game has its fans, and despite the many frustrations I have with it, I too consider myself a reluctant fan of the game. But the answer should be simple. Why dredge up a problematic release that performed poorly? A game that can best be summed up in its current state as a curious relic, a footnote that tried a lot of new things, some of them extremely cringe, but there is evidence that a remake is well into development. Capcom confirmed in December 2023 that they are continuing to remake Resident Evils, but remain silent on which ones. The most obvious contenders are Code Veronica and 2009's Resident Evil 5. The company stopped development on a fan remake of CV quite recently, indicating that we could very well be getting the unthinkable. Despite its chronological messiness, there are 3 periods of Resident Evil. The classic, some might say antiquated survival horror period that started with the release of Resident Evil 1 in 1996 and ended with the prequel Resident Evil 0 in 2003. Then there's a survival action period that began with the sea change of Resident Evil 4 in 2005 and ended around the release of Resident Evil Revelations 2 in 2015. And now the survival horror revival period, which has gone down 2 congruent paths, that of the first-person sequels Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, and the aforementioned remakes of 2 through 4. Resident Evil 1 also got a remake, but that came out all the way back in 2002, so there is no easy way to categorize this series that also happens to be my favorite series of all time. What are you going to do? What makes Code Veronica such a necessity is in how essential the game's plot turns out to be for the entire series moving forward. In other words, it was the first game to nod towards the survival action period. To me, it is a messy contradiction of questionable vibes and thrilling strategy, a game that will repeatedly test your patience while simultaneously playing with you in ways that are sadomasochistic. And it should come as no surprise that the Souls games draw inspiration from classic Resident Evil game design. Code Veronica just pushes this design to my boiling point of frustration. CV is by far the longest of the early Resident Evil titles. Even a breezy expert playthrough will last you around 5 hours, which might not seem all that long until you juxtapose that with the original trilogy, all of which can be blasted through in roughly a cinematic hour and a half to 2 hours. Code Veronica is so long that it released on 2 discs, not because it was cutscene and voice acting intensive like Metal Gear Solid, but because there was simply so much game. We're thrust back into the shoes of Claire Redfield, who we last saw make her debut in Resident Evil 2. She's looking for her brother Chris, one of 2 main characters of the original game, back in 1996. Chris is an affable meathead, more brawn than brains.
No! Don't go!
Able to take more damage, but also only able to hold 6 slots in his inventory. I always thought this was pretty funny, like, does being unable to hold that many items signify some loss of intelligence? He's a member of STARS, short for Special Tactics and Rescue Service. STARS is a privately funded group of ex-military and scientists who are sent in to investigate the bizarre outbreak in Raccoon City, in which the nasty T-virus was leaked, infecting most of the city. This becomes an obsession for Chris. Claire never finds him, instead linking up with rookie cop Leon Kennedy, who would of course go on to star in the most popular game in the franchise, Resident Evil 4. Though Claire's search in Resident Evil 2 turns out to be a fruitless one, she's given a lead that Chris is somewhere in Europe, trying to get to the bottom of the Umbrella conspiracy. We'll go through RE2 another day, but just know for now that she and Leon survived their time in Raccoon City. The base in Europe is where Code Veronica's opening cutscene happens, and it is quite the tonal shift for the franchise. Claire has gone from a college student to action hero in the span of 2 years. She's captured and sent to a remote prison island where the first half of the game takes place. And the prison is quite the setting for a Resident Evil, establishing some pretty intense vibes right away. It's difficult categorizing the different sections of the island as they're all relatively small and weave into one another. There is no line of demarcation like in RE2, a linear through point that goes from police station to the sewers to the lab. Claire's escape begins first through a graveyard of zombie prisoners, then between either a military training facility or a palace, which each house their own secret facilities within, such as the airport or another palace. The first half of CV is most in line with Nemesis in that you're constantly juggling between the outdoors and smaller interiors. There is no other way to describe the Rockford prison than as a concentration camp. Imprisoned zombies rise from the grave in their drab olive uniforms, indicating just how insane and indifferent the Umbrella Corporation truly is. I'd recommend watching my other videos for a more in-depth look at Umbrella, as the corporation has become a shell of itself by the time of Code Veronica. Rockford Island is situated in the Southern Ocean near Antarctica. It's quite in line with the Sega tradition, who haven't been afraid over the years to situate some of their games in troubling post-apocalyptic dystopias or even World War I Germany. What these choices indicate can surely be triggering, and it should definitely be asked if these types of locations are appropriate for video game escapism, but Resident Evil has always been a series that has tried to have its cake and eat it too. It is one thing to situate your game inside a rich capitalist mansion, or a city's corrupt police station, or even an entire corrupt city, but it is an entirely different thing to conjure up the idea of the Holocaust or the modern-day horrors that are presently raging in Palestine. The bleakness attempts to fit in not just from a storytelling perspective, but from a necessary hardware implementation, because Code Veronica is also the first game in the series not to use pre-rendered backgrounds. Pre-rendered backgrounds were an essential element of the PlayStation trilogy's interpretation of survival horror. Not only did they fit the series' colorful yet macabre tone, they functioned as a compromise to the limitation of the PS1's horsepower. This was a graphical illusion, in other words. But while the games looked better as a result, there were some compromises like stagnant camera angles and occasional freezing. CV trades in the static but vibrant photorealism for something a little more bland and militaristic, but the fully 3D environments meant the gameplay was quicker and more fluid than it could ever hope to be on the PlayStation 1. We also get new ideas like the metal detector hallway. Claire must dump all of her metal, namely guns, ammo, her signature lighter, even ink ribbons, in order to reach a 3D printer that can create an alloy copy of the metal that gets her into the two main locations of the prison. It is also where we meet Steve, who in my best estimation is like a Canadian deconstruction of Leon. I'm sorry, Canada. Steve is... yeah. I once made this comment on Sphere Hunter's review of the game, and while there is some truth to it, I'm ashamed I phrased it the way I did. Steve is entertaining, but he's entertaining in an ironic way. Let me be clear here. I do not think Steve is cool. He is unintentionally funny to me, but he also does some woefully annoying and troubling shit that makes me question why the developers made him the way they did. Steve is a 17-year-old who in 2024 displays a remarkable amount of incel energy. Some might label it as teen angst and move on. I have absolutely no idea if Steve was intended to be this cringe, but then again, this was a game made back in 2000 before there was much sense of irony in video game storytelling. A lot of his screen time is spent fixating on his chauvinistic attitude towards Claire, even going so far as to be a lecherous creep and a distracted, lovesick boy. With the benefit of hindsight, I'd like to replace entertaining for fascinating because, as a deconstruction of Leon, Steve represents the reality that Claire is pretty much alone in her quest to find her brother. Rodrigo's wound means he's restricted to the jail cells and nothing else. If CV does get the remake treatment, I'd love to see Rodrigo play a more active role in the story. Steve suggests to Claire to email Leon, notifying him of her location.
Why don't you send your brother the coordinates and ask him to come help?
Thanks, I'll do that.
Hey, I was just kidding. There's no way he could get here, even if he is your brother.
Yes, he can, I'm sure of it.
No way. He won't come. You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
What was that all about?
Claire is able to outsmart the metal detector and make her way to the first big exploration choice in Code Veronica. Does she turn right before the bridge and tackle the training facility, or does she continue straight and into the Ashford Palace? The training facility is an incoherent mess of elevators and underground shortcuts that gets pushed to an even more ridiculous extreme by the time Chris takes over. It is where Claire can find the bowgun. It is also the first time in the game where making a choice can severely hinder Claire's progress. If Claire chooses to tackle most of the Ashford Palace first, she will lose the ability to use the bowgun for an exceptional amount of her playthrough. To alleviate this, the developers give you dual semi-automatic pistols in the prison camp. Good luck picking them up early on, though, because they take up 2 slots. Of the classic survival horror period, no game is more action-heavy than Code Veronica. RE4 would implement a more action survival approach, honing in on precision gunplay over strategic survival, while Code Veronica definitely still favors survival. It does this by throwing a lot of zombies at you, more than any other game in the classic period. Much of this has to do not with how challenging CV is, but rather as a way to showcase the superior hardware that was the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2 over the original PlayStation. CV gives you a ton of options on how to deal with the added enemy counter. A perfect early run can net Claire the handgun, dual automatic pistols, the bowgun, and the knife. Yes, the knife. The knife is Code Veronica's secret weapon. It is what makes the game, in my opinion, the most minute-to-minute fun of the entire survival horror period. Claire was a rookie combatant in RE2, much like Leon. In Code Veronica, she has taken what she has learned and made herself a nimble agent of death, swiftly moving through environments and popping zombies at close range like John Wick, quickly accessing her inventory for the knife, and then finishing them off on the ground with the most satisfying of kills. There are 2 ways to play Code Veronica, the conservative way and the fun way. The latter way requires using the knife, but it also means you're going to take a lot of hits. Fortunately, Claire is more like Mega Man than a Dark Souls protagonist, able to take quite a few more hits before death now. The gun and knife method requires quick movement, always looking forward and knowing when to dodge past the zombie and when to take the bite. Shake that rascal to the floor and knife away. Credit where credit is due, the makers of CV got this right in a way that the original trilogy simply couldn't. The knife was originally viewed as a bit of a joke item, or at the very least an item that required an expert level of knowledge of Resident Evil. That changed post-Code Veronica. Resident Evil 4 in particular, both the OG and its 2023 remake, make the knife a focal point of the player's arsenal. While it's certainly accurate to describe Code Veronica as a difficult game, its difficulty lies in its sadomasochism towards the player. It's less a matter of difficulty than a matter of rote memorization, or how much punishment you're willing to endure. Noah Gervais' review of the game equates it to failing a driving test on the first step, but the instructor can't say anything until after the entire test is complete. There are very likely points in which a first-time Code Veronica player will have to start over from scratch. I say this because I have experienced this multiple times. The jokes begin early on when Claire is struggling to find a save room. The first save room took me almost an hour to find my first go-through. To make matters worse, Claire begins with 8 slots but is constantly bombarded with new items she must either choose to grab or leave for later. She could drop all the metallic items into the security box, which cruelly functions as the game's first item box, but you can't place non-metallic items in there. This means any herbs you have must be held onto, but also the instruction manual. Yeah, the instruction manual now takes up a slot in Claire's inventory. In an ironic twist, the knife has finally become useful, but at the expense of sticking you with another useless item. Another potential punishment lies in the basement of the training facility. I should probably mention the addition of a new enemy to the canon, the Bandersnatch. These fuckers are similar to hunters in that they are bipedal and usually take a few rounds from your heavier arsenal in order to take down. There's a room near the Clement chemical Chris needs that is blocked off by steel crates, but we can hear the plodding footsteps of Bandersnatches. Later on, Claire can unlock a door in order to get the grenade launcher, and going into the next room leads us to, you guessed it, the room where both Bandersnatchers are. Kill them both, and you earn your one and only reward, 3 ink ribbons. So the game design is trying to teach you something, it's just that what it's trying to teach you wastes so much of your time, with the payoff being little more than a stiff troll job. Take that, asshole. You now have 6 less explosive bolts, but hey, at least you've gained 3 ink ribbons. What a moron you are for exploring our game. The palace is home to the Ashfords, an ultra-wealthy family of aristocrats who co-founded the Umbrella Corporation along with the Spencers. It is here where we meet Alfred Ashford, current proprietor of the family. I use proprietor loosely here because...
Oh? You must be one of Umbrella's lower level officers if you're in command of a backwater base like this one.
How dare you!
Like Steve, all subtlety and nuance are immediately thrown out of the bathtub in favor of a campy, megalomaniacal approach. Their introduction is firing a sniper rifle at Claire and blaming her for the T-virus outbreak on the island, which turns out not to be true for a reason we will soon get into. Apparently, Arthur has no idea that Claire was captured and imprisoned here, indicating they are just as incompetent as they sound. They're a rich, spoiled brat, a failure of nepotism. It was Alfred's father who made Umbrella a household name, and now the pathetic image of the reality that the Ashfords and Umbrella are crumpling before our very eyes. It'd be one thing if Alfred was simply a dopey video game villain, but Code Veronica does something bold and, by some accounts, extremely offensive. Claire discovers that Alfred has 2 identities. The other is of their twin sister, Alexia. The twins were genetically bred in order to ensure the continued legacy of the Ashfords, but only Alexia was blessed with a high intellect and potential. Alfred took this personally to the point of conjuring up another identity, one in which they believe themselves to be Alexia. Thus begins the biggest concern of Code Veronica and its potential for a remake. Alfred/Alexia's depiction is so utterly transphobic that substantial plot threads probably need to be rewritten. The makers of Code Veronica use Psycho as inspiration behind Alfred's split personality, a sort of contemporary attempt at Norman Bates, but in conversation with their sister rather than their mother. Unfortunately, the writers did not have the chops to pull this off convincingly or respectfully, instead opting for a baby-brained approach that equates trans femininity with being a hideous monster. And this entire crisis of identity thread is negated when we come to discover in the game's second half that Alexia is in fact still alive and the game's actual villain. Throughout centuries of prevailing Western thought, it was presumed that sex was something we're born into and then gender is culturally determined following that. Biology in particular assumes a transcendent universal in which a boy is born into this world because he has testosterone and a girl is born into this world because she has a vagina. But this distinction is entirely arbitrary when matters of dress or movement enter the fray. For example, in a heteronormative culture, it is expected that a man wear his hair short while a woman is expected to wear her hair long, or a man wear pants while a woman wear dresses. But again, aren't these differences assumed? The reason they aren't believed to be arbitrary is because we still live in a strictly heteronormative order of reality, or what Sarah Ahmed calls the straight line. If a body does not follow the straight line out in the world, there will be consequences, either one of intense indifference in which your humanity might be questioned, or of brutal judgment, or hell, maybe both. If you disagree with that assessment and identify as a cisgendered man, wear a dress into public and see what happens. Oh, you're afraid to? Congratulations, tough guy. You live in a heteronormative world in which you're afraid to be judged for doing something unconventional. I say all of this because I can't help but wonder why fans are clamoring for a Code Veronica remake without having much of an idea what to do about this whole Alfred debacle. And these are the same folks who I can't for the life of me figure out are being sincere or sarcastic with their love for Steve. And it makes me question which side I was even on when I made this shamefully cringe comment back in 2021. But I'll say this, if you believe in 2024 that the depiction of Steve is genuinely pretty much fine the way it is, I wouldn't be shocked if you're cool with leaving the Alfred stuff as is either. Steve seems to be far more a topic of interest than Alfred anyways, as Alfred kind of becomes irrelevant once Wesker is reanimated back into the franchise. Absent from parts 2 and 3, Wesker returns in Code Veronica as another megalomaniacal dipshit hell-bent on the annihilation of all but the most exceptional of the human race. His performance in the RE4 remake, the scenes with Ada in particular, make him look like a bastion of subtlety in comparison to his B-movie theatrics here. He mwahaha's like Count Dracula in Sesame Street, officially amping the goofiness of Resident Evil up to 11. Wesker's return, as entertaining as it can be, seals the deal on the first chapter of the Resident Evil franchise, trajecting towards its more banal, neoconservative middle period. Resident Evil 5 brought the Chris and Wesker rivalry to its appropriately inane climax. But 10 years earlier, it was absolutely absurd as a Resident Evil fan to witness former Stars co-workers Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker transition from shady mansion business and betrayal to Saturday morning fisticuffs. What is Wesker doing here? It has everything to do with what I said earlier about Code Veronica being the essential bridge in the series. He died at the hands of the first tyrant in the first Resident Evil, where he was portrayed as a shady and selfish guy, infinitely more unsettling than he is here. He injected himself with the T-virus before death, making him a superhuman bioweapon with cat eyes. He's even brought a new mechanic with him, security cameras that can summon a hunter on site if the cameras spot Chris. Ultimately, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt by the developers to reach into the past, dredge this has-been up, and make him as banal and cartoon villain as possible. It's actually pretty funny that the consensus seems to have narrowed it down between Resident Evil 5 and Code Veronica as the next remake, because those are the two games that are most in love with the rivalry between Wesker and Chris, which is little more than a dick measuring contest between an alpha male and a man trying to become one. Speaking of masculinity, it should come as no surprise that Steve also happens to be a gun enthusiast, nearly getting himself killed when trying to grab the gold Lugers from the Ashfords' man cave. The Lugers are teased as a weapon for Claire, but they are only playable in the game's Mercenaries mode that becomes available once you beat the game. Claire finds double Uzis that Steve naturally lusts after, and we must trade the Uzis for the Lugers so Claire can reach the other codependent Ashford house. We then play a very brief section as Steve in which we can use the Uzis on zombies in the military basement. Unload that entire sucker because you ain't getting another chance to use them until Chris's section. Steve proves to be surprisingly useful as he clears a path for Claire. One of my favorite scenes in the entire game immediately follows. We come to learn that Steve's a prisoner on the island because his father was a spy that got caught by Umbrella, making Steve guilty by association. Coincidentally, the minute after we find this out, Steve's zombified father comes out of the woodwork and is fixing to chomp into Claire. But the boyhood wonder comes through in a remarkable display of courage that is both deeply cringe and hilarious.
Father!
There are points favorable to Code Veronica's aesthetic as the first game in the series not to take place in Raccoon City. Alfred and Alexia's personal codependent mansion that is tucked away behind the double Luger doors is undeniably atmospheric in its Victorian goth presentation, though again, it is clearly a nod to Psycho. And I totally dig the Antarctica base as a setting for Resident Evil, conjuring up vibes of The Thing or any other number of horror fiction that takes place in an isolated wintry wonderland. It's sort of disingenuous to say that the game is split evenly between Claire and Chris, because the ratio we play as Claire to Chris is closer to 65-35%. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. While all of this convoluted nonsense is taking place, Claire's objective here is quite simple. She must escape the island so she can continue her endless search for Chris, and in order to properly get off the island, she must find 3 crests. Sound familiar? The crests are appropriately military. A Navy, Army, and Air Force crest must be found and slotted into a crazy rich man's panel so that a platform elevator can move 3 inches, officially granting Claire and Steve access to the cargo plane that can whisk us off this godforsaken rock. Instead of recapping the rest of the game, let's do a retrospective of all the bullshit we must endure in order to beat this game. It took me 24 years, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't pump an unironically triumphant fist in the air in front of my wife after getting this 24-year burden off my back. I literally developed my first ever boil in my 37 years of existence the same week I mustered the courage to watch a carcinogen Let's Play, thanks Carsey, and finally beat the shit out of this cursed experience. The first 4 Resident Evils were all developed by different creators, which is one of the reasons why I love the first period so much. Nostalgia also plays a huge factor, but the differences in design philosophy between Shinji Mikami, Hideki Kamiya, Kazuhiro Aoyama, and Hiroki Kato are also different that I'm willing to forgive the latter's trolling, because for as wacky and questionable as Code Veronica can be, there is something undeniably quaint about it that has stuck with me for all these years. And yeah, you can bet a lot of it is based on memories of being tortured by it. Hiroki Kato was the same schmuck who designed the boulder booby traps in the caverns of the original Resident Evil. Imagine if he'd gone on to design Tomb Raider instead of a long-ass Resident Evil game. I'm not entirely sure if I'd be willing to trade in those memories. In Alex O'Neill's Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of Resident Evil, we get a sense of Kato's devious nature. Quote, I have an affinity for booby traps in my games. People actually complained about them to me during development, but I really like it when players have to think hard in order to figure out how to beat the game. End quote. And he wasn't kidding, because it took me 24 years of hard thinking and Let's Play watching in order to slay this dragon. So let's dive into Kato's board game design philosophy by glossing over the more iconic choke points in the game. The fire extinguisher is perhaps the most iconic of the CV choke points. Early on, Claire is tasked with grabbing a fire extinguisher that negates the chopper fire, resulting in her grabbing the briefcase that holds the non-metallic alloy needed to get us deeper into the prison. However, the extinguisher remains a tangible item in Claire's inventory space after its use. In the PlayStation trilogy, Resident Evil has a consistent rule, and it is this. A key is not the same as a key item. A key, when no longer useful, will prompt the player to discard it. However, key items like the valve wheel in Resident Evil 2 or the cranks in Resident Evil 1 cannot be discarded because there are multiple points in the game in which they must be used, and can be used again and again if the player is lost running around in circles. The fire extinguisher is renamed Empty Extinguisher once Claire uses it. Like most players, I assume this to mean that it no longer served a purpose. Remember when I said earlier that it can take upwards of an hour to find the first safe room and item box? If an item is stored in an item box, that item will be stored in every single item box in the game. The metal detector hallway security box, however, is not an official item box. So naturally, a first-time CV player will most likely dump the metallic empty extinguisher into the security box and forget about it, because why would we ever need it again? Turns out, there's a magnum in the Antarctica base that is blocked off by fire, and guess what? The only way Chris can obtain it is if he goes into an item box, grabs the empty fire extinguisher, refills it, and then extinguishes the fire. But if that fire extinguisher is still chilling in the security box at the beginning of the fucking game, Chris is shit out of luck in having a magnum. It is entirely possible to beat the game without the magnum, but if you're a first-time Code Veronica player, you will more than likely use all of your health items and ammo, because enemies do respawn, meaning the game punishes the player for getting lost. A lot of your tolerance of this game boils down to your willingness to completely start over, which leads into the second point of bullshit. The tyrant at the end of the prison. This is the one that affected me most personally when I first played Code Veronica in 2000. I rented the Dreamcast from Blockbuster, meaning I didn't have a memory card or virtual memory unit as it was called on Dreamcast. No memory card meant that every time I died playing Code Veronica, I was forced to start completely over, marking my first unofficial experience with a roguelike. So perhaps my tolerance for CV's unfairness stemmed from that. I didn't even make it past the prison during my weekend rentals. There are 2 tyrant fights in the game, and both are in small arenas. The first is on the bridge leading to the palace. It's a hallway fight. Tyrant walks forward, and Claire must quickly unload her arsenal before it makes its way to her, where it can swipe her into the fire for instant death. Simple enough. The second fight is on the cargo plane, which Steve somehow knows how to pilot, leaving Claire to her lonesome to face off with it in the cargo space. It's not that the fight is all that challenging. The problem is an age-old problem with the classic design of Resident Evil. I've heard countless people say they fell off the PlayStation trilogy because they kept running out of ammo and health items, soft-locking themselves into a situation where they simply got overwhelmed and gave up. Code Veronica gave me, a self-professed veteran of the PlayStation trilogy, that very same feeling. There's an easy way to defeat Cargo Plane Tyrant, or CPT, but it requires an expert understanding of Code Veronica that can only be gleaned through repetition or watching a Let's Play. Remember that metal detector hallway? On the other side of it, there are BOW rounds, a new type of grenade ammo. There are only 3 rounds of it, which means they must be super effective. The BOW rounds kind of work like the Demi spell in Final Fantasy. Every hit cuts the CPT's health in half. So if Claire knows beforehand to grab the BOW rounds from the security box and save them for the CPT fight, all 3 of them can knock its health down to 12.5%. The first one has its health to 50, the next 25, and so on. Meaning it would only take a couple precious explosive bolts to ensure knocking his ass out of the cargo plane and into oblivion. The problem with this method is that if you're playing this way, you already have a lot of ammo stocked up, which then begs the question, where is the survival horror? Code Veronica suffers from a rather irredeemable flaw. It is woefully unbalanced. Either you're terrible at the game or you're way too good at it, and the only way to get good at it is to learn from your mistakes and completely start over. The moth hallway goes under the radar in the bullshit department, but that doesn't mean it isn't equally as unpleasant. It functions as the central point connecting the upper and lower floors of the Antarctica base, meaning it will be necessary to backtrack through this hallway multiple times. Running in a straight line gets you to the safe room, or Claire can turn left and make her way deeper into the base. 3 moths will be waiting for you, and they are all able to inflict a poison status. In addition, they fly in chaotically unpredictable routes. Auto-aim isn't even a guarantee you'll shoot them down. Even better, the moths respawn even if Claire can somehow gun them all down. But in ironical CV fashion, the developers do throw us a bit of a bone by placing an infinite blue herb plant in the hallway. But again, perhaps a question should have been asked. Is any of this interesting game design? Well, I don't know if it's interesting, but we get another Steve fuck-up when he's distracted ogling Claire, sending the snowmobile they need to get to the final area right into a pipe that leaks toxic gas. Fortunately, Claire is here to save the day, finding and using the valve wheel, which makes its triumphant return in Code Veronica as a key item that must be reshaped into an octagon-fitting formation. All this extra work for Claire. This is what happens when a boy tries to do a woman's job. The makers of this game were clearly aware of how dastardly their design was. Dying on the Nosferatu fight, for example, doesn't require you to restart from the menu and reload your last typewriter save, but rather conveniently checkpoints you back into the action almost immediately. Steve mortally wounds Alfred with the Uzis at point-blank range, and Claire can use Alfred's sniper rifle in the upcoming fight with Alexander/Nosferatu. Alfred and Alexia's psychopathy knows no bounds as they tortured their father, injecting him with some new strain of the T-virus that made him blind and an incredibly annoying boss fight. The sniper rifle isn't necessary to kill him, but it certainly makes the fight easier if you know how to use it. The problem is that this is a sniper rifle developed for a survival horror game in the year 2000, meaning it's about the most clumsily awkward thing to handle. Claire is stationary when she's in first-person mode, and the foggy conditions make it almost impossible to score a direct hit on his weak spot unless she's 3 feet away from him, which kinda negates the whole idea of using a sniper rifle in the first place. Miraculously, I was able to brute force my way through this fight by implementing a strategy of running as far away from him as possible and John Ramboing the entire assault rifle clip into the poor bastard. When this wasn't enough, I equipped my now automatic pistol. Like a lot of other bosses in the game, Nosferatu can poison, and he can knock Claire off the battlefield for instant death. Jesus Christ, we're still playing as Claire? After the Nosferatu fight, we finally began Chris's 35% of gamer time by exploring a modified version of the training facility back on Rockford Island. He is the one who is now searching for Claire. Nice. It is a labyrinthine mess that has shortcuts aplenty, but the problem is in funneling out the sheer frustration of knowing which floor leads you to the next objective. The base is already 3 floors with Claire. Chris's section adds a second basement floor, and once Chris grabs the shotgun off the hook, the way back up to B1 is gone. It had to have been a joke to implement so many different elevators confined to a single area. There's the main service elevator that can take Chris to either the second floor of the biology lab, the first floor with the mirrored save room, or the basement proper. Then there's the huge freight elevator which leads down into the airport but takes us up to the courtyard of the training facility. But this is already way too confusing because the initial passage to the airport was through the Ashford Palace. Then there's the elevator at the very beginning of Chris's section that takes him up from the cavern where we encountered Rodrigo and the sandworm, which takes us up to the other courtyard of the training facility where Alfred's giant tank is parked. Still with me? Finally, we have the rink-a-dink forklift elevator reserved for Chris that takes him from the first floor to the second floor only, getting us to a path that was entirely blocked off in Claire's campaign. If Chris takes the service elevator down to the basement before exploring the second floor, he will be punished because there's a side pack on the second floor that nets him an additional 2 inventory slots, making this the first time in Resident Evil that Chris can hold 10 items. The basement boasts an obscene amount of violent treasures, the aforementioned shotgun, which you're penalized for taking too early, flame rounds, a plethora of shotgun shells, hell, even another clip for the assault rifle that is currently sitting at 0% on Claire's person. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. There's one more cargo elevator next to the brown cargo elevator that takes us back to the first floor of the training facility lobby. Chris must make his way through the airport in order to grab the Army, Navy, and Air Force crests that Claire needed to access the cargo plane. So we're kind of doing what Claire did in reverse. The airport as Claire was a breeze. The biggest challenge there was equipping the lighter to keep the bats at bay so the developers could show off the no longer impressive lighting and shadow system. Chris must battle hunters. These hunters are rough enough, but there's an even better prize awaiting the Elder Redfield once we return to the cargo elevator with our 3 prize crests, the Poison Hunters. The Poison Hunters can not only wipe you out with just a handful of swipes, they can inflict poison on you. This is unpleasant. It's even more unpleasant how the game situates Chris during the courtyard encounter. He emerges out of the elevator and instantly faced with 2 hunters heading towards him. Our door to salvation is right behind them. In RE1, hunter encounters are manageable because you're usually starting out right in front of a door, meaning the only space you need to be aware of is the immediate space in front of you. Here, Chris is directly in the middle of the battleground, and of course there's those pesky security cameras I mentioned earlier that can respawn hunters, but they're not that difficult to avoid, thank God. I've already listed 5 ways this game can softlock you into restarting, but Kato's interpretation of the zapping system may be the most egregious example yet. The zapping system was introduced in Resident Evil 2 for replayability purposes. In that game, you could choose to play as either Claire or Leon. Beating the game as Claire, for example, nets you the B playthrough for Leon. Though it isn't that impressive by 2024 standards, there is one key choice that can potentially make things either easier or harder for Leon. There is a room in the police station that has both a submachine gun and a side pack. You could choose to take both in the A game, but doing so means the locker is empty for Leon's already more difficult B game. Any items not in the security box that are equipped to Claire after defeating Nosferatu will be completely inaccessible to Chris. And remember, Claire has 10 slots, so it is very likely as a first-time player to have the grenade launcher, bow gun, the heavy hitters, all still attached to her, meaning you're shit out of luck having access to any of that as Chris. However, there are double Uzis Chris can immediately obtain, but it means also having to get the lighter back. There is an optional side quest in Code Veronica involving the lighter and the lockpick. which are specialty items that don't take up space in your inventory. In Resident Evil 2, Claire's specialty item is a lockpick, taken after Jill in RE1, while Leon's is a lighter. Code Veronica begins with Rodrigo giving you his lighter. Later on, Claire finds medicine for Rodrigo. Backtrack to the jail cells with the medicine, and Rodrigo gives you a lockpick as reward, which at least now Claire can unlock previously locked drawers and briefcases which hold some very much needed explosive bolts. The only way Chris can obtain the lighter is by defeating the sandworm that occasionally pestered Claire in the training facility courtyard. Now here's the bullshit. The sandworm boss fight is optional. During Claire's campaign, we're taught to avoid the sandworm because it can't be killed. Now we know why. It's a boss fight in Chris's section. Because the game trained you to run from the sandworm as Claire, you're most likely to run away from it as Chris, but the sandworm swallows Rodrigo whole. If you run away from the sandworm fight as Chris, you will forfeit your opportunity to obtain the lighter, even if you return later and kill it. I know this because this happened to me in a playthrough of the game I was unable to document. If Chris returns to the boss fight and kills the sandworm, he will get nothing because we've given the worm enough time to digest Rodrigo, meaning he's dead and therefore unable to cue the cutscene in which Rodrigo gives you the lighter before dying. So you already have to know to fight the sandworm head-on immediately after it swallows Rodrigo whole, and only then. This side quest is cool in theory. If you know exactly what to do to obtain the lighter in Double Uzis, it's a rewarding full circle moment for Chris, who now has the lighter Claire was using at the beginning of the game. However, if you're like me, you will have spent literally dozens of hours over the course of 2.5 decades making small mistakes that the game severely punishes you for. Many people say these mistakes can be rectified by making multiple save states, but again, you don't know as a player when you're potentially screwing yourself, and multiple save states cannot redeem the next choke point. The booby trap and Steve double whammy. Code Veronica's penultimate choke points requires 2 remarkable feats from the player between saves. First, we're finally awarded with the reunion of the Redfields.
Claire.
Chris! I missed you so much.
Control is briefly given back to Claire, who must figure out a way to crack open this crystal ball containing a security card, and this is how we do it. A lot of players have expressed frustration over this, and yet I, the schmuck who has managed to be screwed over in nearly every conceivable way by this game, have never died on this part. I'll admit, both times I've gotten this far in Code Veronica, I've been fully aware that this section sucks and must be approached with delicate, razor-like precision. But this is only half the battle, because up next is the final time we'll ever have to endure Steve. The very mean, very evil Alexia does the things she did to her poor father, but Steve doesn't have to wait 15 years to meet his agonizing end. Thus, he prematurely mutates into the Jolly Green Giant. This isn't a boss fight like Nosferatu. And unsurprisingly, Code Veronican fashion, this is by some accounts even worse. If you decide to run straight ahead, 2 hits from Steve's battle axe equal death, meaning you need at least 1 first aid spray or fully healable herb to outlast him. There is a strat, again thanks to Carcinogen, where Claire can start the chase by running behind Steve, getting him stuck in the environment. Clearly another one of Kato's endless abuses on the player. I still got hit twice employing this strategy, but we're home free and are treated to Steve's demise. Good riddance, mate.
I'm glad that I met you. I love you.
Once Chris jets his way from the prison to the base in Antarctica, we come to discover a familiar setting. For a game whose second half feels so rushed and incomplete, it's appropriate this Resident Evil's final area turns out to be a half-assed replica of the Spencer Mansion from the original Resident Evil. I'll go into more detail in my Resident Evil 1 retrospective, but the next game in the franchise, a remake of Resident Evil 1, took the concepts from Code Veronica and made them work in a way this game could only dream of. But maybe that's why we need a Code Veronica remake in the first place. Chris's half of the base is different enough from Claire's, the only overlap really being the valve wheel and a reworking of the main hallway, which is now an ice rink that's home to a rather forgettable spider boss that I didn't even bother to capture. The moth hallway is a non-issue now, one of CV's rare blessings. Beyond the ice rink is a new pathway that leads Chris down into the mansion decoy, which has wallpaper imitating a cloudy blue sky and a small horse carousel, which I guess is supposed to remind us of the Ashford siblings' bedrooms. There's even a fun callback to the tiger statue from the first game, complete with its own puzzle involving turning the power off so the head will remain still in order to pick up both jewels. After the brief interlude with Claire, control returns to Chris, who must immediately do battle with Alexia. I could make this another choke point, but my willpower in both playing and talking about this game has severely diminished. But yeah, the game does not give you time to prepare for another major boss fight. Luckily, I kept the Magnum on me, which, if you simply stand still and fire all 6 rounds, will take her down.
I shot him 6 times. What? I shot him 6 times.
Fortunately, the developers checkpoint you here, similar to the Nosferatu fight. Could you imagine having to do the booby trap, Steve's chase, and this fight all without a checkpoint? There's a common refrain here, though. None of these boss fights are fun. Alexia's campily shite attitude makes her yet another unremarkable villain for this series. She is nothing more than a mean-spirited ghoul, one who genuinely believes herself to be a queen ant who sees everyone around her as simply drones who exist only for her bidding. This is frightening in theory and quite in line with Umbrella's indifference towards humanity, but there is no pushback, no reason to care beyond her Saturday morning theatrics. A good remake, I think, would have to attempt to make Alfred sympathetic if Alexia remains the true villain. Maybe some Succession-esque banter between the two. Like, give us something here that is more than a remedial depiction of a shitty rich family. And I'm not trying to say here Succession is an amazing show. I think it's kind of overrated in some ways. I'm just saying, give us something between these two rich assholes. Alexia becomes her destiny, which is a blandly annoying final boss, and Chris must juggle between getting whipped by poisonous tentacles and evading her attacks. Do enough damage and it's rocket launcher time, a staple of the classic survival horror period. This time we're treated to the linear launcher, because it's the year 2000 and we can't simply call things what they are. This is Kato's final challenge. Can Chris fire off one direct hit to an aerial Alexia? Do so in its credits. We did it, Joe. We've beaten Code Veronica. We're teased with a proper ending to Umbrella in the next game. Wesker retreats, and that's Code Veronica. This is the game's main issue, and it is an all-encompassing one that covers both gameplay and the larger story. There is simply too much of it. Too many unlikable people, too many elevators, too much game. And this is removing the fact that Code Veronica's resurrection of Wesker means we have to put up with his banality for an entire decade. Wesker even self-owns the franchise and kinda even forecasts the next period of Resident Evil when he says,
It turns out that Alexia's work wasn't much of anything. So now the only thing left is revenge.
Code Veronica asks you to wallow in the bullshit of a failure you couldn't have seen coming and start completely over. It asks you to accept an incel who thinks he's in love with Claire, a small-brain depiction of gender nonconformity, and the resurrection and subsequent transformation of a Duke Nukem wannabe who has gone from single-game villain status to absolute villain status in what amounts to little more than the Mr. Burns' good evil aesthetic. Code Veronica demands a lot out of you in order to get there, and in the end, I'm left more with regret than relief after having finally finished the game. A Code Veronica remake could be a great thing, but so could a lot of things that should probably be left to wither in the past. Certainly, a lot of its antiquated design would have to be radically altered or excised entirely. But in doing so, does this flatten the game's already limited personality? I wouldn't have been able to make 50 minutes of content for this game if it wasn't already so weird and punishing. This is my concern, and it is one that reminds me of the Resident Evil 3 remake. How much of the original game must be sacrificed in order for it to even be worth it in the contemporary sphere? Can Steve be redeemed? Can Alfred be redeemed? This is why I'm glad I'm not a game developer. I won't lie, I'll pump my fist if we do get a CV remake, but it will be a trepidatious one. I still think it's a more interesting game than RE5, a game so far up its neoconservative ass that just thinking about it is motivating me less to finish this video. So let's finish it. Beating Code Veronica, finally, after 24 years, this is how I feel. It feels like taking a massive dump. You know that feeling you get when you're constipated and you're just thinking about it and it's weighing on you? You could be driving to work, you could be at home, you could be in bed trying to sleep. But wherever you are, you're left constantly wondering to yourself, when am I going to get this shit out of me? It took me 24 years as a Resident Evil fan to accept everything this game has put me through. I hate it in more ways than I love it. Code Veronica gives you that classic survival horror feeling, that feeling of dread, that feeling of...
I can't!
The difficulty increases seem exponential as the game goes on, relative to the first 3 games of the franchise. And here's the thing, the only reason it's the hardest game of the original 4 is a bad reason. It's because it's twice as long as the first 3 games. It demands too much out of you as a player. And Code Veronica's pacing and design do not earn all the hurdles it throws at you because the game is simply not interesting enough, neither in its storytelling or its gameplay. And maybe that's why we don't need a Code Veronica remake.